Good afternoon. Welcome, students, faculty, staff, honored guests, and other members of the Wabash community to the 42nd LaFollette Lecture. Longtime attendees of this event will note an absence among the audience, as Gary LaFollette, the son of the lecture's honorant and a faithful presence at this event, is unable to join us today due to a recent bout of COVID. Nevertheless, I'd like us to acknowledge the continuing legacy of Gary's family at Wabash and to wish Gary a speedy return to health. This lecture is named in honor of Charles D. LaFollette, a graduate of Wabash and member of the Board of Trustees between 1952 and 1977. Leif, as he was known by friends, came to Wabash from the hamlet of Thorntown in 1916. As a student, he was actively involved in the humanities and the arts, serving as managing editor of The Bachelor and student director of the Glee Club. He went on to a distinguished career with Corning Glassworks and the Dow Corning Corporation. Leif and his wife, Ibby, generously endowed the distinguished professor of the humanities as a way to affirm that, quote, the one indispensable asset and continuing requirement of a good college is superior teaching, end quote. This lecture, established as an annual event by the Board of Trustees upon Mr. LaFollette's passing in 1982, honors Leif's lifetime commitment to the liberal arts and in particular to the humanities. Events such as this one arise from a tradition of public lectures at places like Chautauqua and Aspen, where intellectuals are freed from the burden of making a watertight argument. Instead, lecturers explore beyond their discipline and entertain big issues of universal human experience: beauty, joy, suffering, wonder, the power of stories, how we are to live with one another and within our environment. In other words, the LaFollette Lecture, like a musical recital, an art exhibit, or a play, engages a broad audience both intellectually and aesthetically, both inspiring and delighting in equal measure, and more often raising questions than positing answers. In that spirit, there will be no question and answer period today, but instead, I hope you'll all continue the conversation at a reception at Wally's Pub in the Spark Center immediately after the lecture. There'll be appetizers and soft drinks, as well as other beverages available for purchase. I'm pleased now to introduce last year's LaFollette Lecturer, Professor Amanda Ingram, who will present this year's speaker.
It is my great pleasure to introduce this year's LaFollette Lecturer, Dr. Bronwen Wickkiser. Dr. Wickkiser is a native of Baltimore, as the alert among you will detect in her Tidewater-inflected vowels. And she began her education in Baltimore City Public Schools, where she had her first experience with single-sex education at an all-girls magnet school, and her first introduction to the classics when assigned to read Aristotle. She went on to earn her bachelor's degree in Latin at Oberlin College and her MA in Latin and PhD in classics at the University of Texas at Austin. I first met Dr. Wickkiser in January 2013 when she interviewed for her current position. Defying the chilly day in a drafty Center Hall seminar room, her research presentation transported me to warm, sunny Greece as she described a mysterious underground space in the building at Epidauros, the celebrated healing center of ancient Greeks. She spoke about her collaborative project exploring the function of this space and offered a novel hypothesis about how it might have been used. This idea was described by a reviewer of the resulting book as an intriguing and exciting thesis about the form and function of one of antiquity's most beautiful buildings. But what struck me as most notable was that a humanities scholar was working as part of a collaborative team. The value Dr. Wickkiser places on conversation with colleagues from different fields to spark ideas, and her recognition that humanities can be a team sport have been key to some of her most original insights. She instills this ethos in her students as well, encouraging teamwork as her freshman tutorial students learn to row like the ancients did on Eagle Creek, or guiding senior classics majors through course-based original research projects. Those who know of Dr. Wickkiser's passion for rowing will no doubt see connections between the teamwork required to efficiently crew a boat and the benefits she's reaped from collaborating on research projects. But perhaps you didn't know that Dr. Wickkiser also enjoys the more solitary pastime of paddleboarding, and similarly has produced fascinating solo research projects. Her first book, focused on the rise of the cult of Asclepios, the famed healer, was a more typical single-author humanities project. In this work, Dr. Wickkiser draws on her own diverse intellectual interests to argue about the importance of political factors in the introduction of the cult of Asclepios to Athens. Dr. Wickkiser's teaching is also informed by these broad interests and her desire to make connections among seemingly disparate bodies of knowledge. Her students learn to see the relationship between the ancient world and the modern one, and across disciplines as they work together to explore topics ranging from ancient medicine to modern-day epidemics, to art, archaeology, and film, and ancient texts. She even serves on a subcommittee of the Classical Association of the Middle West and South that gives an annual award to an undergraduate demonstrating excellence in both classics and STEM disciplines, named, of course, for America's favorite physician, who also majored in classics, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Dr. Wickkiser is also passionate about the power of travel and immersion learning. In her personal travels, she is a collector of islands, and she takes students abroad to experience ancient spaces and material culture. Dr. Wickkiser's work has been recognized by teaching and dissertation awards and an assortment of fellowships and grants, including Wabash College's own McLean, McTurnan Arnold Research Scholar Award. I could go on about our speaker's many accomplishments, but it's time for me to turn over the lectern to Dr. Bronwen Wickkiser for the main event, this year's LaFollette Lecture titled Embodied. Please join me in welcoming her.
Good afternoon, Wabash. Good afternoon, friends of Wabash College. It's good to have you all here today. All right, I'm getting set here. We've got some new lights. Oh, this is very exciting. I want to thank you, Amanda, for that really generous introduction. Dr. Ingram had asked me whether I would like to read a copy of her introduction before today, and I said, no, I'd like to just enjoy it in the moment, and I'm very glad that I did. That was just beautiful. Thank you, Amanda. I want to extend special thanks to the LaFollette family for making this lecture possible, and I want to do so in ancient Greek. The statement is humein karen apodidomi. Humein is a pronoun that means y'all, and it sounds a lot like the word human, which is a nice coincidence given today's endeavor where we are thinking about the humanities. The word karen means thanks, and is directly related to a verb that means rejoice. It's embedded in our word Eucharist, a good rejoicing. The verb is apodidomi, a compound of I give, didomi, and the preposition back, apo. So this short Greek statement then suggests a collective sense of reciprocity and rejoicing, which seems especially appropriate for the LaFollette Lectures, an occasion when we come together as a community to share our work and celebrate the humanities and what it means to be human. So to the LaFollette family, I say again, humein karen apodidomi. I am deeply honored that I was invited by Dr. Cheryl Hughes to give this lecture. When she invited me a year ago, I was flabbergasted and humbled, especially when she added that this might be the last invitation she'd extend for the LaFollette Lecture because she was planning to retire. There was no way I could refuse that invitation. Thank you, Cheryl, for the invitation, which means so much to me, especially coming from you. I also want to thank all of you for coming out today to spend time hearing about my work. Today, my theme will be bodies. As a classicist, I have long been interested in the embodied experience of the ancient past, particularly in areas of religion and healthcare, and often at points where these two areas intersect, such as at healing sanctuaries where people sought cures from the gods. Today, I'll be talking about a recent direction in my research on ancient medicine, and to do so, I will also talk about the bodies of data, the corpora of evidence, that I draw upon to make sense of the ancient past. And along the way, you'll hear a little bit about my own background and education. Now, I do feel the need to begin by clarifying what classics as an academic discipline is. I am guessing there is at least one person in this audience who's not entirely sure, which is no shortcoming of theirs. Let's face it, classics is an enigmatic term. Classic what? Classical music, classic cars? Loosely put, classics as an academic discipline is the study of Greek and Roman antiquity. This encompasses study of two of the languages widely spoken in the ancient Mediterranean, Greek and Latin, the literatures that were produced in these languages, the material remains of the Greeks and Romans, what they did and how they lived. That's a lot under one umbrella, which leads me back to the term classics. It has lingered in part because of its economy. It's a shorthand of sorts meant to indicate what all it is that we classic scholars do. Yet it is also true that the term implies a value judgment, that what we study is somehow essential or more important than other fields. Indeed, the word is an artifact of a time when knowledge of Greek and Latin language and literature was thought to be essential to an educated person. And by person, we should probably understand white, male, of a certain pedigree and level of wealth. The good news is that classics as a discipline now encompasses much more than a study of language and of literature produced by elites. And we who are classic scholars, and I feel confident that I speak for my colleagues in classics here at Wabash, we believe fervently that there is much in the Greek and Roman past that is valuable for all of us today. And I say this as a woman who is in a field that is still very male-dominated. This is the second time in my academic career that I am the only woman in my department. Other than in graduate school, I have never had an immediate colleague in classics who is a person of color. So now we'll see a little bit of me here for a moment. I'm taking a page out of Dr. Jerome Adams' talk last fall, where he showed a picture from his youth. As Dr. Ingram said, from kindergarten through high school, I attended Baltimore City Public Schools. This is my 7th grade homeroom class. And it grieves me that the greatest diversity I have experienced in my life was in my childhood, before I left for college. Now you're probably looking at this slide thinking, which one is she? Have you figured it out? That is I. One of the major challenges of understanding antiquity is the limits of the evidence. I sometimes begin courses with an image like this, a fragmentary statue of a human figure. I intend this as a metaphor to get at the very incomplete nature of what remains from the ancient past. Only a small fraction of all the data of antiquity survives and has been recovered. There is a very real possibility as we work to reconstruct the past, that is, to restore, say, the arm of the statue or the color of her skin, that we will get some things wrong. Greek and Roman statues would have been bright with color. We know this because traces of paint survive on some of them that suggest that every detail, hair, clothing, jewelry, skin, was painted. Yet for a long time, scholars perpetuated the idea that marble statues and architecture were left unpainted, contributing to a myth of whiteness about Greek and Roman antiquity. This is a good reminder that as we interpret the past, we need to be careful about imposing our own value judgments about aesthetics, and yes, also about race, on ancient data, about recreating antiquity as we think it ought to have looked. This leads me to humility. Humility, I assert, is useful in any academic discipline, certainly so in classics, for the reasons I've just mentioned. I foreground the need for humility with my students, and I do this especially in my course on ancient medicine, where, yes, there is a concern about misinterpreting the ancient data, but there is also the risk of looking at the past smugly from a vantage point informed by millennia of scientific discovery. Those Greeks and Romans, how silly they were, how naive, how wrong. Yet there is still much today that we do not understand about the human body. Let's test ourselves, shall we? Now, I realize that this is a room mainly full of humanists, and this is meant as a rhetorical exercise above all, but here we go. Do you know what causes epilepsy? The Greeks debated this. They had various theories for the cause of epilepsy, and scientists still to this day do not fully understand the causes of epilepsy. Do you know how this epilepsy drug works? I'm not even going to pronounce it for you. My thanks to Mark Elrod, who used to work in a pharmacy and shared his knowledge of epilepsy drugs with me. And there is no shame, of course, if you can't tell me how this drug works. What floors me, though, is that neither can the pharmaceutical company that developed it. I draw your attention to the green, the text in green, the mechanism of action. Yeah, the precise mechanisms by which this drug produces its analgesic and anti-epileptic actions are unknown. They know it works, but they cannot explain how it works. Humility is good, right? Genetics, DNA, these are ways that we interpret the body currently. But in 100 years, maybe these too will sound a bit quaint. My course on ancient medicine has become one of my favorite courses to teach. What I enjoy about the history of medicine is seeing the connections, the continuities and discontinuities over thousands of years about an aspect of human life that is universal. All of us, at one time or another, get sick, no matter when or where we live, regardless of status, politics, religion. Sickness and health, some combination thereof, is essential to the human condition, and the Greeks and Romans knew this well. Homer's Iliad, our earliest surviving work of Greek literature, begins with the god Apollo shooting arrows of plague upon the Greek army. As I like to say, Greek literature begins with a disease and the dis-ease, the unease that accompanies it, the suffering, the anxiety, the search for causes and solutions. The Greeks and Romans would continue to reflect for centuries on the health of bodies and of the body politic in all sorts of literature, works of tragedy, philosophy, histories, and medical texts. Yet I suspect that if all we had to look at from the ancient past were texts, as brilliant as they are, as inspired and inspiring as they can be, I would not be a classicist. When I went to graduate school, there were two tracks in classics, one in philology, focusing on languages and literature, and the other in archaeology, where the focus is on material remains. I chose philology. I really do love Greek and Latin. I've been studying Greek on and off since my senior year of high school, and I will remind you that I attended a public high school in Baltimore, and as Dr. Ingram has said, it was and remains to this day all female. Yes, all female public high schools still exist. I got an education there that I will be forever grateful for, in part because it allowed me to see females in positions of power. It was also where I began to be enamored with classics. My teacher for ancient Greek was passionate and fun. He told us one day that he was in a band, and they called themselves Ajax and the Comets. I'm glad someone laughed. Because this may not sound funny to you if you don't know your kitchen cleansers, but I did, and I thought it was hilarious. Fast forward to graduate school, where, as I say, I chose philology as my track. But there was no way anyone could convince me to sit around a library every single summer. Indeed, I took many opportunities to join in archaeological fieldwork, whether in Greece, where I excavated Byzantine remains in Corinth, and the slide on the left is me excavating a grave in Corinth, or in Italy, where I took part in an archaeological survey of an ancient synagogue in Ostia, the port of Rome, and worked on pottery analysis for a Greek sanctuary in Metaponto, which is in the insole of the boot of Italy. I also spent 2 of the most remarkable summers of my life in Ukraine, in Crimea, an area that is now under Russian annexation. The first summer, we were excavating a Greek farmhouse of the 4th century before the Common Era, just outside of Sevastopol. And that, in the slide on the right, that's me inside the Greek farmhouse. I think this is when I just found a coin, and everything stops on an excavation when someone finds a coin because they want to clean the site and photograph it. So that's why it looks like nothing's happening here. The second summer I was in Ukraine, we were a bit farther east in Crimea. We were in Balaclava, where we excavated a fort and surveyed a necropolis. I saw no Greek or even Roman remains that second summer. We were busy digging through Upper Byzantine layers, but we also found buttons worn by soldiers in the Crimean War of the 19th century. Those summers in Ukraine were magical. Teams of Russians, Ukrainians, and Americans working side by side just 5 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the independence of Ukraine. We lived in dachas, cottages, in an archaeological park, amid ancient ruins, right on the shore of the Black Sea. And here's another view. You can see that maybe the ruins in the background on the slide on the right. Given the current war in Ukraine, I am so grateful to have had these experiences. More generally, all of this archaeological work was a joy. The physical labor of it, the teamwork, immersion in other cultures, training your tongue to form words in new languages, kogdala, kharasho, biazimiania, these are all words I learned to say when I was there. Encountering new foods, the redolent smell of fresh dill that flavored many of our meals, still to this day takes me right back to the shore of the Black Sea. All of this puts one's life into perspective. And if you have the chance to work on an excavation, no matter where, there are few thrills greater than recovering data that has been waiting underground for hundreds, or in the case of antiquity, thousands of years. Even if you do not excavate, just coming into direct physical contact with objects produced in antiquity can be a thrill. I always tell my students, hug a column, and I'm delighted that Ethan Boyd is here tonight. He came to hear this talk. So let's face it, my days of recovering artifacts from the earth are probably over. Yet in my research, I very much enjoy putting texts, where my primary training lies, into conversation with objects and spaces from the past. My interest in healing gods is driven in part by the materiality of much of the data. And just here are some examples. I study narratives inscribed on large stone blocks that stood in the center of sanctuaries and describe how gods healed certain individuals. I study body parts sculpted from clay, stone, and metal that were given by the sick as thank offerings for their cures. I examine bronze medical instruments dedicated by physicians to their patron god. And I explore elaborate architecture designed for healing. These I put into conversation with texts like medical treatises, but also courtroom speeches, hymns, comedies, and even a series of short Greek poems about healing that were recovered in Egypt from, I kid you not, mummy cartonnage. So these were poems about healing that were written on papyrus. They're actually in the upper right-hand corner. You're seeing some of the text from these poems. They were written on papyrus, and that papyrus was reused to cover the chest of a mummy. Poems about healing recovered from mummy cartonnage? Talk about embodied, and boy, that gets me excited. Until very recently, in all my work on healing sanctuaries, I had been dodging the elephant in the room, an enormous corpus of data that I had drawn upon selectively, but had not gotten to know very well. That corpus is the writings of a single individual, the Greek physician Galen, who lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era and healed, among others, Roman emperors. He also wrote a lot, well over 100 medical texts, and many of these survive to this day. Indeed, his writings alone comprise 1/10 of all surviving Greek literature from Homer through the end of the 2nd century. 1/10. That's huge. Still, many classicists do not read Galen. Part of the reason is that Galen's writings are medical texts, not literature. For a long time, the focus within classics on certain kinds of texts, poetry, polished historical narratives, and the like, afforded little space for thinking about medical literature, much less for thinking about the bodies of most inhabitants of the Greco-Roman world. The study of ancient medicine is a recent subfield of classics. So why do we have so much of Galen's literary output, more so than of any other Greek or Roman author? Part of the reason is that scientists, physicians, and philosophers, among others, have long been interested in what Galen has to say about anatomy and physiology, about pharmacology, about logic and empiricism. These scholars would read Galen and hand his texts on, having them recopied to circulate not only in Greek, which is the language in which Galen wrote, but also in Latin, Hebrew, Syriac, and Arabic. Some of his treatises survive only in Arabic, and there is a huge tradition of Islamic scholars from the Middle Ages on who studied and commented on Galen's writings, like Hunan ibn Ishaq and Ibn Sina. Galen's work exerted a deep and far-reaching influence on medical practice well into the 19th century, even here in the United States, particularly his view of the body's mixtures, which is an expansion and elaboration of Hippocratic humoral theory. And I'm sorry I don't have time to talk about that today, but I will move on. I think you can see from what I've said already that Galen is a major figure from Greco-Roman antiquity. And in the time that remains, I want to give you a brief overview of Galen's fascinating life and talk a bit about one of his texts in particular. Galen was raised in Pergamon, a large, wealthy, culturally diverse city in the Roman province of Asia. He was from a well-to-do family who set Galen on a path of rigorous training in both philosophy and medicine that began in Pergamon and continued with teachers in Ephesus, Smyrna, Alexandria, and many other places. This was his equivalent of going off to college and medical school. He then returned to Pergamon to begin his own medical practice. I am struck by the impact that the city of Pergamon itself exerted on Galen. First, Pergamon had one of the largest and most popular sanctuaries of the healing god Asclepius. Galen would have been aware of this sanctuary and its many displays of the human body. Moreover, Galen himself was healed by Asclepius. Galen was also intimately aware of gladiatorial combat, having been appointed physician to the gladiatorial school at Pergamon. He served in this role for at least 4 years, coming into contact again and again with human anatomy in ways that most physicians would never have seen. There were taboos against dissecting human corpses, and thus direct knowledge of human anatomy came mostly from chance encounters with bodies open through violence, battles, gladiatorial combat, and the like. Indirect knowledge of human anatomy came from dissections and even vivisections of animals like monkeys and pigs. Indeed, Galen won his position of physician to the gladiators based upon an anatomical demonstration in which he disemboweled a live monkey, pulling out its intestines while the monkey is writhing and screeching. And in this moment, he challenged other physicians in the audience to come forward, replace the intestines, and secure them within the abdominal cavity. No one came forward. But Galen assures us that he himself successfully completed the procedure. He also, in the same demonstration, by the way, I don't know if this was the same monkey or a different monkey, but he talks about opening large arteries of the monkey So you have, again, you have the sonic experience in the spectacle. You have a visual of the monkey screeching and the bowels being pulled out. And then you also have this blood kind of coming out of the monkey as well. Again, Galen sort of issued a challenge to the audience, and once again, no one came forward. But I think you can see why Galen won that position through that demonstration. It was quite a feat. Galen would also have seen bodies on display across the Acropolis of Pergamon, such as these statues installed in the 3rd century before the Common Era to celebrate a military victory. So these statues, too, would have been brightly painted. And I don't know if you can make out, but where the figure on the left is plunging a weapon into his own body, you can see blood pulling out of that wound. Also, the figure on the right, along his abdomen, there is blood. The figure on the left, the way this is often interpreted as he's killing himself because he has just been defeated, of course, by the Pergamenes, and instead of suffering enslavement or death at their hands, he chooses to kill himself. Galen would have seen statues also on an enormous altar to Zeus, also on the Acropolis. This altar, the remains of this altar are now in Pergamon, and around it, around the front of the altar, runs a frieze of gods battling giants. This frieze is a tour de force of Hellenistic sculptural style. The figures are larger than life size, the bodies moving, twisting, writhing, the emotions expressed on the faces amplified. Worshippers were meant to come face to face with these figures. Notice how some of the figures crawl up the very stairs that worshippers would have ascended. This modern observer is Charlie Chaplin, by the way, which I think is interesting given how sort of physical Chaplin's comedy is. Galen grew up around this art, around these rituals of gladiatorial combat and divine healing that put the human body front and center. But Galen grew restless in Pergamon, and at the age of 32, he arrived in Rome, a city where he would spend most of the rest of his life, a city of about 1 million inhabitants, where for most people, average life expectancy was under the age of 25. Wabash students, welcome to middle age. One medical historian has remarked that in squalor and lethality, Rome far exceeded any modern city. She goes on to add, Galen practiced medicine for decades in one of human history's most unhealthy environments. Here in unhealthy Rome, Galen treated very many people, from the enslaved to elites, conducting more bloody, noisy anatomical demonstrations and debating rival physicians on the streets of the city, quickly building a reputation as a highly skilled healer. His reputation would reach the emperor, Marcus Aurelius, who summoned Galen to Aquileia in northern Italy, where the Romans were fighting the Marcomanni, a Germanic tribe. Galen was put in charge of treating sick and wounded soldiers there. Within a year, though, Galen returned to Rome, only to be appointed personal physician to the son of Marcus Aurelius, a youth named Commodus. We'll be hearing more about Commodus in a moment. Meanwhile, Galen wrote a lot, as we have heard. So let's turn now at last to one particular text of Galen's. The title in Greek is Peri Aloupias, which we might translate loosely as How to Avoid Distress. It's a bit of a memoir and a self-help book. Now, if I were giving this talk 20 years ago, which I realize is a lifetime to a Wabash student, but I'm beginning to realize that in an academic career, it's kind of a nanosecond. But in any case, if I were giving this talk 20 years ago, I would not be speaking about this text. The reason is that 20 years ago, we didn't know that it still existed. Here's what happened. Scholars had known the title of this text. Galen mentions it elsewhere, and quotations from it had been excerpted in Arabic and Hebrew. But the full text was recovered only in 2005 by chance. A scholar from France came across it when conducting research in the library of a monastery in northern Greece, in Thessaloniki. There it was, a copy of a text originally produced some 1,800 years earlier, believed to have been lost for good. The copy that was found in the monastery, by the way, was made in the 15th century. So obviously it's not just from the ground that we recovered data from the distant past, and maybe I should have spent some more time in libraries in graduate school. Well, what does this newly recovered text have to say? It's essentially a response to a lifelong friend of Galen's, who has asked Galen how it is that he seems not to be suffering distress despite having lost very much property in a recent fire. From other sources, we know that a major fire ravaged Rome in the year 192, when Galen was in his early 60s. Galen describes this fire in the treatise Perialupius. The Great Fire, as he calls it, tore through the center of Rome, beginning at the Temple of Peace, moving through buildings along the Via Sacra, which is a major road in ancient Rome. It ran right through the Republican Forum. The fire then climbed the Palatine Hill, where not only the imperial palaces were located, but also the Palatine libraries. Galen does not say whether the palaces were damaged. I don't think he cares at all about the palaces. But he writes at length about extensive damage to the library collections. According to Galen, the fire destroyed important works of philosophy by Plato, Aristotle, and Theophrastus, critical editions of Homer by Alexandrian scholars, along with noted works by orators, doctors, and grammarians. Some of these books existed only at this library. Galen tells us there were no copies. This was a great loss to Galen, who used the Palatine libraries for research and to make copies of some books for his own use. Many of those copies that Galen made were also lost in the fire. Galen had been renting storage space in a warehouse along the Via Sacra. Perhaps you thought that storage units were a recent American invention. Not so. The Romans had them, and they lined their roads with them too. Galen had been storing many books and other materials related to his medical practice in one of these warehouses. He had thought the particular warehouse where he rented space was fireproof. He even remarks the only wooden components were the doors. Still, the fire burned, destroying Galen's collections not only of books, but of medical recipes, also wax molds for casting medical instruments, some of his own design, spices like cinnamon, imported all the way from India, a key ingredient in a compound drug known as theriac that was used as kind of a panacea, a cure-all. He lost other drugs as well, including perhaps his collection of prized tablets of medicinal earth from the Greek island of Lemnos. It is information like this that excites me. Here, Galen lifts the curtain on the social history of healthcare in a way that few other sources do. I'm working on a project now on medical tourism in antiquity, and I'm curious about the transit not only of patients, where are they traveling to be healed, what do they want to have healed, and the like. I'm also interested in the travel of practitioners. Most practitioners in antiquity were itinerant. They moved from town to dispense healthcare. And I'm very interested in the materia medica, the transit in drugs, instruments, recipes, and all these aspects of ancient medicine were crisscrossing the Mediterranean. I like to talk about the Mediterranean to my students as a superhighway of antiquity. And all this material and these ideas were just were buzzing across the Mediterranean. And this particular text of Galen's shines a bright light on the topic. Now, I'd like to engage in an aside for the moment about Lemnian earth. This is this medicinal earth from the island of Lemnos. Greeks and Romans used earth from Lemnos for all sorts of ailments. eye conditions, so if they had an issue with their eyes, they might use lemnian earth, ulcers, snake bites, plague, a host of other ailments. They even used it as an aphrodisiac. Sometimes it was ingested, other times it was applied to the skin. Galen himself sailed to Lemnos to learn more about how the tablets of lemnian earth were produced. And here's what he learned by watching the process. A priestess of Artemis harvested the soil when it was wet with spring water. She formed it into tablets, stamping each of them with an image of a goat, and then she laid them out in the sun to dry. After this, the tablets were ready for distribution. Galen believed so strongly in their therapeutic benefit that he shipped 20,000 tablets of lemnian earth back to Rome. Okay, so we might be thinking, what the heck? They used earth as a cure? We still do something like this today. Maybe you've heard of terramycin. In the 1940s, the pharmaceutical company Pfizer discovered that soil near one of its laboratories contained antibiotic compounds. They marketed this as terramycin as early as 1950. The terra of terramycin means earth, but not just any earth. Pfizer discovered the antibiotic compounds in earth located in Terre Haute, Indiana. That's why it's called terramycin. So there you have it, a close link between Indiana and a small Greek island, between ancient and modern medical practice. And you can still see here that terramycin is used for eye conditions. Oh, the humility. All right, back to the fire. Galen goes through this inventory of things he's lost in the fire. And he says, let's also keep in mind, dear friend, a couple of other recent phenomena that have caused many people distress. The first of these additional phenomena was a pandemic, the so-called Antonine Plague, which may have been smallpox. It caused the death, in Galen's words, of very many people. Perhaps 25% of the population of the Roman Empire died. That would be roughly 15 million people. Galen was on the front lines of treatment, almost literally. Remember that he was with the Roman troops at the battlefront in northern Italy. The year was 165, the same year that the plague hit. He spent the first winter of the disease with the army, and he observes that during winter the disease was worse, which might sound familiar from our experiences with COVID. This plague also had recurring outbreaks for more than 2 decades. Here, I want to remind us again about humility. We are still learning about COVID. It's hard for scientists, even in the 21st century, to keep up with a rapidly evolving virus. I'm not entirely sure it's over, despite what President Biden recently said. The second additional source of distress was a narcissistic, unpredictable head of state. This would be the Emperor Commodus. Commodus became sole emperor when he was 19 years old and ruled until he was assassinated at the age of 31 in the year 192, the same year as the Great Fire. Commodus was quite a character. He thought he was a new Hercules, often dressing the part, as you can see here. As emperor, he spent a lot of time in gladiatorial arenas where he himself fought both men and animals. As to narcissism, he wanted to rename Rome Commodiana after his own name, and he replaced the head of a giant statue of Nero outside the Colosseum with his own likeness. It's hard to one-up Nero in terms of vanity, but Commodus may have outdone him. Moreover, Commodus was so defensive and anxious about his position as emperor that he ordered either the execution or exile to distant lands of almost anyone he perceived as a threat to his authority. No one was safe, certainly none of the elites with close ties to the imperial court, like Galen. So how did Galen manage all of this? Surely he felt distress. All of us know what it's like to deal with a pandemic that threatens lives and lingers. Moreover, some of us may be wondering about the health of our own body politic, especially in the wake of the assault on the United States Capitol. Furthermore, some of us, especially women, might be concerned about the fact that we have less autonomy over our reproductive health here in the state of Indiana than we did just 1 week ago. As you surely know, new laws restricting abortion access went into effect on September 15. There were no laws against abortion in Greco-Roman antiquity, certainly not through the time of Galen. It is sobering to me to think that women in Greek and Roman antiquity had more legal autonomy over their bodies with respect to abortion than we have today in parts of the United States. As to large-scale fires, along with floods and other natural disasters, we hear about these frequently in the news as a result of climate change. Despite all of this, the fire, the plague, Commodus, Galen's response to his friend is, "I don't feel distress." This ushers in the self-help portion of his text. Now, I'm not going to discuss his recommendations about avoiding distress in detail. I'm not sure we want to follow his advice. And of course, I'll leave solutions for avoiding distress to your own mental health care professionals. But I am struck by the fact that Galen's preventative measures have him leaning into what we might call his liberal arts education, specifically into philosophy and literature. "Friend," he says, "you know as well as I, we studied philosophy together in Pergamon, that desire often begets more desire. Who, unlike most people, is not distressed? Those with only a moderate attachment to esteem, wealth, reputation, and political power." So he says, it's okay that I've lost a lot of property, even irreplaceable items. I mean, he also lost books that he himself had written. He said, it's okay because I have enough food, I have shelter, I have my family and friends. What does concern Galen is the very real possibility of losing his family and friends. "What will distress me is the destruction of my homeland, a friend being punished by a tyrant, and other things like this. And I pray to the gods that none of this should ever happen to me." Pray though he might, Galen does not leave the aversion of disaster entirely in the hands of the gods. Rather, he trains his body and mind daily to prepare for misfortune. In addition to a good diet and regular physical exercise, he engages in a kind of proto-cognitive therapy by reminding himself, reciting to himself, a passage from a now lost tragedy by the poet Euripides. One of the characters in this tragedy says, "As I once learned from a wise man, I fell to considering disasters constantly, adding for myself exile from my native land, untimely deaths, and other ways of misfortune, so that should I ever suffer any of what I was imagining, it might gnaw at my soul because it was a new arrival." Galen seems to believe that he can avoid distress by envisioning misfortunes in detail before they occur, training his mind to anticipate the suffering they would cause. He even repeats this passage, this very same passage, twice over the course of Perialupias, so it rings like a kind of mantra for him. Now, Galen does acknowledge here and in other texts how very fortunate he is to have been born into a family with considerable resources and exposed to a great education. He knows he's privileged. He also remarks how hard he has worked to master the discipline of medicine. He studied and practiced almost compulsively. For this reason, he disdains many other elites and even says that he never wanted to serve the imperial court. He hates the posturing, the faux intellectualism of privileged men who have not worked hard to learn anything deeply. Galen can spot these people a mile away, and he eviscerates them intellectually, kind of like that monkey. Perhaps Galen's therapies worked. He would outlive Commodus by about 20 years and would serve yet another emperor, Septimius Severus. So he serves at least 3 emperors: Marcus Aurelius, Commodus, Septimius Severus. Commodus had left no heir, by the way, and in a single year, Rome went through 4 would-be emperors until one stuck, Septimius Severus from northern Africa. Now, I mention this in part because there is a beautiful portrait bust of Septimius Severus at the Ashkenazi Museum in Bloomington, on which traces of paint have been found. We can't see that paint anymore with the naked eye, but this wooden tondo gives us an idea of how colorful the portrait bust must have been. As to Galen, he died finally in the early 3rd century at the age of about 87, which just goes to show what a good diet, exercise, and access to very good health care can do for you. So that's a little bit about the elephant in the room, Galen. It's a little bit about one text with relevance to us in the 21st century, a text that puts me in Rome, on the Via Sacra, that puts me in touch, even indirectly, with the stuff of the practice of Greco-Roman medicine. Moreover, it's a text that I hope demonstrates how the study of healthcare makes for an intimate connection to the distant past. Over the years, listening to LaFollette lectures, I have marveled how so many of my colleagues have brought their talks to a beautiful conclusion, tying up all the loose threads in an elegant way. I'm going to resist the temptation to do that today. Instead, I'm going to leave hanging some of the threads that I've pulled upon. The word solution means to loosen, not to tie up. And I'm going to leave you with some uncertainty that I hope will lead to conversation. Bodies are often a place where justice and injustice play out. That's probably the most important statement of this whole talk today, so I'll say it again. Bodies are often a place where justice and injustice play out, as the threats posed by Commodus illustrate well, or the sculptures of the dying Gauls, or of gods battling giants. In 2014, I had the good fortune to take part in a National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute in Greece on the topic of mortality facing death in ancient Greece. That institute brought together scholars from various disciplines: political science, history, art, philosophy, religion, comparative literature, anthropology, and classics. The conversations were incredibly rich, informed as they were by a variety of perspectives. We explored in person many ancient artifacts, like this one, the so-called Dipylon vase. It's tall for a vase. It's about my height. I'm just over 5 feet tall, and it's as tall as I am. It stood in a cemetery in Athens where it served as a grave marker, like a tombstone. On it, we see the depiction of a death ritual, the body of the deceased lying out for the community to mourn. Most of the figures are pulling at their hair as an act of grief, even those under the handles of the vase. At the conclusion of the Institute, all of us participants gave presentations about our work, including Dr. Wendy Wright, a professor of political, legal, and urban studies. She began with a slide of the Dipylon vase, focusing our attention on the figures in mourning. And then she projected next to it a slide like this, of a black man being arrested. The bodily gestures are very similar. There's a sort of visual echo. There was an audible gasp from the audience that day in 2014, perhaps most of all from us classicists, who had viewed this vase dozens of times. It's a very famous work of Greek art, but we had never seen it through this lens. Yes, of course, these two items, the arrest of a black man and this ancient vase, are not directly connected. But the juxtaposition, the coincidental similarity of gestures and even skin color are striking. I have not been able to look at this vase in the same way since. How does the image of this man kneeling before police with his arms on his head inform our understanding of Greek antiquity? How does the image on the ancient vase inform my understanding of justice in our world today? I don't have easy answers, but I feel that there is something powerful here that might lead to conversation. And I believe strongly that some distress, some discomfort, is not a bad thing. It can be productive as we look for ways to make our world better for all of humanity. The humanities, when practiced well, have us wrestling with difficult topics, engaging in challenging discussion, informed by a variety of viewpoints, including a view towards the past. As a classicist, and yes, as a rower, I am trained to look carefully at the past while navigating into the future. Thank you all.